What Tom and myself did was we had a little bit of discussion about this, whether we could do something that I certainly never known has been done before, which is to talking about how bees behave naturally from a practical point of view and also from a scientific point of view. Honeybees in the wild, what can we learn from them? Well, some of you know that fairly recently I've had a book published, but I'm very definitely not here to sell books, but I do happen to have a few copies. You can also get them from Northern Bee Books and also on the Bibber website. Oh, right, so that's a bit of fun. What you may not know is that I actually own and run the Dave Cushman website, and if you don't know anything about Dave Cushman's website, it's reckoned to be the world's most comprehensive beekeeping website. So if you don't know anything about it, just put Dave Cushman bees into Google or whatever, and up it should come. Some of you know that if I give a talk, I've usually got a little border collie by my side whose name is Nell. Unfortunately, she's not allowed in here, but I got a message from her. She's so well known that in the last 3 days, I've had people turn up with biscuits for her, which I've got to take home. So those of you, 7 in there. Anyway, so thank you all very much. So my experience then, I've been keeping and observing bees for over 50 years. I started in 1963, and that's the key word, observing, because observation, I think, is one of the greatest things that you can do as a beekeeper. I've actually removed several hundred colonies from wild situations. That's, when I mean wild, that's where they have selected their own nests, nest site. Many of them are pre-varroa, and there's very definitely a difference between pre-varroa and post-varroa. I used to do around about 12 to 15 trees per year until about 1990, something like that, and a few buildings, perhaps 2 to 3. Now, I would think I do 1 or perhaps 2 trees a year, and might be 1 or 2 buildings, so very much less than it was. So the information I'm going to give you is based on observation, me seeing what the bees are telling me, a bit of logic and a bit of conjecture, which may well not go down too well with the research type people, because it's generally classified as anecdotal evidence, isn't it? So I'm basically telling you what whole loads of wild colonies of bees have told me. There's going to be a lot of question marks through here. That's because I don't know the answer, and I'm also going to be asking you a few questions as well. It's easy to learn from bees if we can understand them, which is a pretty obvious statement, but how many beekeepers actually understand their bees, what the bees are trying to achieve? And ask the question, do we work with or against bees? I suggest in a lot of the manipulations that we do, and some that are dreamt up almost sort of overnight, I would suggest it may well be the latter. Do we as beekeepers just simply do what we're told, what the book tells us or the mentor tells us, or we go along to the local beekeeping association meeting and ask a question and get told an answer without necessarily working out why the bees have got in that position in the first place? Or do we actually think about it? Think how the bees have got into that position and find a way out? What I'm fairly certain is the bees very often have the answer before we even think of the problem. If I have a problem with my bees, I try to think how the bees will get out of it themselves, rather than just charging off to the book or the screen or whatever to find an answer. So for the next hour or so, I want you folk to please cast away any views you may have on wild colonies. Just get rid of them. And manage colonies too, so you can have a completely open mind, and you can make up your mind whether the things that I'm telling you or Tom's telling you are necessarily what bees do. One of the Main problems, I think, with beekeepers are they tend to humanise bees. They're not like us at all. Simple thing, we're warm-blooded, or most of us are, and bees are cold-blooded. I mean, that's a simple sort of thing. So I know there is other information on wild colonies that I always get quoted, but it's often American. Not that there's anything wrong in that, but honeybees, to the best of my knowledge, are not indigenous to the Americas, although I think there's a view that at some stage they may well have been. I think because most of the bees have been imported, probably fairly recent years, last 100 years or so, they're going to be far more prolific, and that gives a different sort of slant on things. And of course their climate and conditions vary as well in exactly the same way as ours do. So let's go back a bit. How did bees get to Britain? Well, there's little evidence because bee samples don't seem to survive too well. Yes, there are occasional ones, probably going back 2,000-3,000 years, something like that, but to the best of my knowledge, not much longer than that. So it's most likely they followed the retreating ice after the last great ice age. And then at a later date, they became isolated from the rest of the continent with the closing of the Channel Land Bridge. Now, we tend to think that it was a slow process, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence that it was actually quite quickly closed. There seems to be a tsunami that happened in Scandinavia, which washed a load of water down. But they've survived for around about 8,500 years before intervention from our ancestors. So there they are, isolated. What would those bees have needed? Well, something to eat, somewhere to live, and suitable conditions to do it in. They needed all three. They may well have needed other things, but they needed all three of those. Any one of those missing, and they wouldn't have survived. Clearly, they lived right on the edge of their range all the time they were expanding. My guess is there were quite heavy losses at those times, but I don't know. I've got no evidence at all. But I'm fairly certain those that survived must have been pretty tough. Obviously, natural selection would have taken anything out that was a bit on the weak side. But they were a native honeybee, Apis mellifera, which is about as tough as anything you'll get. So let's just have a look at those then. They evolved to suit our cool, unpredictable climate. Unpredictable being the operative word there, because we know how different years vary. Sometimes you get long warm spells, other times you get long cool spells. So they're said to be non-prolific. Why produce a whole load of brood that they don't need? Because brood is incredibly hungry. They're said to live longer than most of the other subspecies in both summer and winter. Whether that's any more anecdotal evidence or not, I don't know. They're frugal. They look after what food they've got. And one of the ways they can do that, of course, is by controlling the breeding to suit the conditions. So perhaps if they have a fairly long period with no food coming in, the queens perhaps might go off lay. They need less food to survive. And I've seen it in print on several occasions that our native bee against the Italian bee, the Italian, just for maintenance purposes, needs about 2.5 times the amount of food. That does several things, one of which, of course, what it does is puts less pressure on the forage out there, so there's more for those colonies that are in existence. They're heavy pollen storers, which means that they've got more pollen stored throughout the winter. So if you get a long winter and perhaps a poor spring, there's a store of pollen, and I'll be talking a bit about that later. And of course they're hardy, which we know about. They are survivors, because that's what they evolved to be, not sitting on a beach in the Mediterranean. Natural swarming, there is going to be a lot of guesswork here, but I hope you can sort of follow it through, and I hope at the end of the day, Tom and myself, and there's been no collusion here at all, I hope Tom and myself will come up with roughly the same sort of agreement. It's my guess that a natural colony would swarm early in the spring. Now, what I have noticed is that if bees from trees, rather than buildings and managed hives, bees from trees in my area seem to swarm early. Very, very rarely do you get them in sort of halfway through June or back into June or anything like that. Now, why might that be? Well, if you think about it, the earlier they swarm, there's a better chance of survival for the prime swarm and a cast, if indeed there is one. Now, we know that our native bees are non-prolific. It's my guess that naturally they may not have thrown out many casts, or not as many as the much more prolific colonies, simply because they may not have had enough bees in there, in the colony. The earlier they swarm, the more time they've got to build up to winter, because that's really what they're trying to do. Or I think they're trying to do, build up for the winter. If you think about it, it probably suits the colony better as well, because you get a brood break of probably 3 or 4 weeks, something like that. Brood, as already mentioned, is incredibly hungry. So if they haven't got any brood, and they've got a nectar flow, they can bring it in and they can store it. It then gives them more time for recovery, and on many occasions I've had a brood break in a colony, and if you get a honey flow, the bees will fill and cap a super in a week. As an experienced beekeeper, I tend to keep an eye on things like that, because sometimes you've got to get some supers on, otherwise they just fill the brood chamber up, and of course when queen comes back into lay, or a new one gets mated and starts laying, she's got nowhere to lay. It's my guess that the survival rate of natural swarms is a lot higher than we think. I've seen it in print fairly recently that in the wild only 30% of the swarms survive. My guess is that it's very much higher than that. Several reasons. A natural colony tends to swarm when the weather is good. You very rarely get them when the weather's bad. I'm not talking about a managed colony, because I think a lot of swarms in managed colonies are induced in some way. And the reason for that is possibly poor management, question marks again. Anybody guilty of poor management? We've got to keep you awake somehow. Perhaps poor hive design and use. Perhaps the way we use our hives isn't best suited to bees. Exposed to the sun. How many times do you see that you should put a hive in the sun so that the bees can go out and get nectar? I'm fairly certain it contributes quite heavily to swarming, and I'm not so sure it doesn't stress bees too. And we tend to use, or some people tend to use, swarmy bees. And if anyone's ever tried to use carniolans, sometimes they're a hell of a job to keep in the hive. Now, our native bee, Apis mellifera mellifera, about 4 or 5 years ago, a man by the name of John Dews died, and he was leading authority on Apis mellifera mellifera. And he was absolutely adamant that in a natural state, AMM only swarmed every 10 years. Now, I don't know where he got that information from, but I think those people I know who keep native bees, their swarming is usually quite low. If that is the case, It means that the vast majority of queens are superseded rather than they go out with a swarm. They are superseded within the colony. Of course, what's swarming for? Really, it's just to maintain a stable population, isn't it? So you really need almost as many colonies, or as many swarms, plus a bit for losses, as you do for the losses. I'm suggesting from that naturally colony losses are quite low. How long does a natural colony live? I think it's a lot longer than we make it. I'm talking, of course, pre-Varroa. Post-Varroa, we've got a totally different situation. When I started keeping bees, a lot of people worked on the land in some way. They may well even have been born in the same cottage, and though they were 70 or 80 years old, they would know that that swarm that's been in that tree has been there for X number of years. Yes, I know it could possibly die out and then another swarm go in, but some of these really old country folk were pretty sharp about what was going on around them, and I would tend to believe them. It's my guess that naturally losses are perhaps around about 5%, or probably a shade more, perhaps 5 to 10%. But that's what my guess is. Why is that? Well, a few predators, and a lot of colonies are lost during the winter, mice get in or whatever. Got dry conditions. Where do you find a natural nest? 8, 10, 12, 15 feet up a tree, not on the ground where we keep it. And the vast majority of trees are actually dry inside. Healthy. No weaklings, because of course the fittest survived and the weaklings just succumbed a long time ago. In the wild, every colony is a full colony. You don't get little nukes and whatever. They are all full colonies, so they're not as vulnerable as a lot of our managed colonies are. If they select their own home, it's usually with a small entrance. If there is a bigger entrance, they've generally got ways of closing it off. Therefore, little robbing, and of course, one reason for losses is, of course, robbing. And of course, in the natural state, beekeepers aren't involved. Not you, but everybody else. My guess is that before we started messing around with bees, queen mating was a lot nearer 100% than it is currently. Currently, it's way down, 20, 30%, something like that. It really is. But there are problems with getting queens mated, which I've spent an awful lot of time writing about. I suspect in a natural situation, it's very, very high. So why do we have high losses then? Well, we keep bees near the ground, damp and predators and that sort of thing. We tend to keep bees that are perhaps not best suited to our environment. We keep importing stuff, don't we? Keep importing them, and they're not best suited to our way. We mollycoddle bees. We put all sorts of things around them. We insulate them. We treat them with all sorts of medication. What are we doing? We're effectively putting bees on life support, aren't we? If we have a poor colony or diseased colony, perhaps we'll treat it if it's diseased. How many people then requeen it? How many? I suggest not very many, but on the other hand, if a colony or if a queen is susceptible, why keep her? And poor management, which I've already mentioned, perhaps trying to get bees that are too weak going through the winter, poor feeding or anything of that nature. And the queen problems that I've briefly mentioned, and I've been mentioning for the best part of 20 years, but I'll carry on because I'm going to crack this one. Early supersedure of young queens failing, and queens simply disappearing. simply disappearing. So they are issues. And my local teaching association, we had a colony 3 weeks ago. It was absolutely fine. A couple of days ago, in fact Tuesday, the Queen has disappeared. She has gone. We got a queenless colony, and that one gave us, I think, 2 brood chambers of honey and 3 supers on. It gave us the most honey. It had gone. And outside influences, which I'm sure you know a little bit more about than I do. So I'm going to speak to you mainly about bees in trees, because in this part of the world, that's naturally where they will live. A natural nest is much taller than it is wide in a tree. Not in a building, could be anything in a building. Buildings don't always replicate trees, apart from perhaps chimneys, but then you've got a difference, because naturally an entrance is at the bottom if bees can work it that way, but of course a chimney, it's at the top. You tend to get a lot of bees under floorboards. Well then of course they've got to go horizontal. So they're differences, and that's why I'd rather speak a little bit more about trees than buildings. But what I do know is that bees actually adapt pretty well, despite some of the things that are thrown at them. Here's an example. I'm sorry it's an old photograph. That is very nearly 50 years old. It's a big pine tree, and that was the top end of it, by the way. And you can see roughly what happens, but there was a rotten core that went right down to the middle of the nest. And what the bees had done, they built all the way around it. So none of the combs were more than about 3 inches, something like that. So let's just look at a colony and tree and see what happens. And I'm talking now about the first year. And I'm going to put some diagrams on here, which is I've got to apologise for my poor attempt at drawing in PowerPoint. Timing is for southern England, because that's where I've done the majority of the removals. Now, cavities in trees do vary considerably, and I've got one drawn up here, but they really can be quite easily 4 or 5 feet tall. I have seen them taller than that. So what happens with a swarm then, when a colony decides to swarm? And I've got to say, this is my view. If you want to pass any of the exams, don't quote this, because you'll probably get failed. But this is my take on it, but only because this is what the bees have told me. I think when a colony puts, or queen puts eggs in queen cells, if indeed she does, and that's something that's open to a bit of debate too, I think the scouts go out almost straight away looking for a new home. Usually, not always, but usually. And you can see this because if you've got, let's say, a box of some boxes of comb or something outside your back door, you can see bees flying around there for several days, perhaps 6 or 8 days before the swarm comes in. Now, you could argue it's several colonies. I don't know, but I haven't got any paint and markers and things like that all the time to dot round like some people have. Right. I suspect they're going out looking for a suitable home, and in human terms, they seem to pick somewhere that is defendable, dry, perhaps the right size, although I have seen some in buildings in thumping great gaps. Height, there's a bit of discussion about that. We always seem to be told they're just about head height, aren't they, 8 or 10 feet high. Personally, I don't think that matters too much, because I've seen them very low down and I've actually seen them really high. Now, there is one other element, which is energy lines. And I know you're going to say, oh, here he goes about his energy lines again. I actually think it's relevant, but I won't be pushing it too much. But I hope at the end of the day somebody does research on it, because I think it is actually quite relevant. Then perhaps they decide where to go in the hive. That's my guess. I know there's a view that they do it once they've come out and clustered. Personally, I think they've done it before then. Otherwise, why are they spending so long scouting? I think that they seem to take ownership beforehand, and they seem to protect their site. I may be barking up the wrong tree, but on many occasions I've seen a bait hive, and you can see fighting going on at the entrance. I've interpreted it as a colony deciding that's where they're going to go, and they're going to repel all borders. Whether that is right or not, I don't know. And I hope these are the sort of questions that perhaps Tom is going to answer later. Swarm issues and then clusters, as we know. Now, you'll always see bees on the surface of a swarm dancing. And I think people take that as they're deciding where to go. It's only a personal view, but my guess is they've decided sometime before, and all they're really doing is reinforcing where they've actually got to go. I know there's stories about people cycling down streets and following bees and all sorts of things like that, but personally I think it's already done. Now, something else. I think that the scouts that are there waiting for the swarm to come actually guard the new home and defend it. I know it's getting back to human times, but think what happens if all the scouts went back and in the meantime somebody else took ownership of it. I don't know, but I think that is the case. Then of course the swarm arrives. Occasionally that doesn't happen. I was putting my washing out before 9 o'clock one morning, and there it is, and this is the date when this photograph and time when this photograph was taken. 8:54 a.m, June the 9th, 2011. Right, I was hanging my washing out, and over the top of my house, straight down the garden, went a swarm, and I thought, crikey, that's earlier than 10 o'clock. We're always told that they go out. Anyway, I followed it straight down. It went into this hive that was on top of another hive. Now the story is, that hive I brought from outside, gone 9 o'clock the previous evening, and just happened to place it on top of a hive for somewhere for it to go. So in that case, that colony could not have done very much scouting. So I think it is very, very variable. So what does a swarm take with it? Well, obviously a queen also takes drones. Have a look at a swarm, see what's in it. Why does a swarm need drones? If they've got a fertile queen, they don't need it. If they've got a virgin queen, it's much better surely if she got mated with somebody else's drones. I don't know the answer. I should perhaps have put a question mark there. They take workers of all ages. Now I know what some of the books tell you. They take about half the flying force. Have a look at a swarm, see the age of the bees, and you'll see little greyish sort of downy bees that clearly haven't flown before. Why do they do that? Well, of course, the young ones are produce the brood food, don't they? We're told they take honey with them. I put here nectar because I don't know, and I don't know if anyone's ever done any studies as to whether they do take honey or nectar. If you think about it, if they take honey, they're taking more carbohydrate content than if they took nectar. But whether that's the case or not, I don't know, and I hope we get the answer this afternoon. They take pollen. You can see bees in a swarm taking pollen with them. Now, in our terms, we seem to think that is insurance against bad weather. So they probably do as well. Right, now the energy lines, and I'll be really brief on this. If you take a tree with a hole in it, every colony that I've come across that has selected its own home, whether it's a bait hive, an empty hive, a tree, building, anything like that, has got at least 3 energy lines going through it. Now, let's not worry too much about it being sort of pseudoscience or anything like that. Just think of it as a sort of line of energy that goes through the nest. Right. It's my view that they do that, perhaps to do with navigation, but I don't know. I'm not sure of it. All I know is that bumblebees and wasps don't do the same thing. I hope at some stage somebody's going to do some work on it, but I think it's. I think they'll find something anyway. But I did ask you to have an open mind, and I'm going to return to this later because it is more relevant elsewhere. Right, take a section through a tree with a cavity in it, and they're never that shape, but it's my attempt at PowerPoint. The entrance is usually at the bottom, not always, but it's usually at the bottom, and fairly close to the nest too, although I have had some that have been that far away from the nest. I want you folk to assume that cavity is empty, because slightly different things happen if there's already comb in there. So the swarm starts, as soon as it goes in there, swarm starts building comb. I won't say almost straight away, but certainly with an hour or two, obviously at the top. The bees quickly place nectar and pollen in the cells, and if the queen is fertile, she's usually laying well within 24 hours. And anybody who's taken a swarm one afternoon or evening, imprisoned it overnight and gone and tried to put it in a hive 9 o'clock in the morning, that's usually what you get. If you've got a fertile queen, 80% of the time there's going to be eggs in the cell. So really get cracking. That's the sort of amount. Probably only one, perhaps the start of a second comb. They really get cracking, and even that has probably got nectar and pollen in it. Right, so we're still back with their tree. They've got no brood to feed for 4 or 5 days. Therefore, any food they've got, they can produce wax, and of course, it's in the first few days that they do an awful lot of building. Then starts a really rapid build-up over the next week or so. The brood then starts to get sealed. The brood nest expands and develops. All the time the bees are producing more wax underneath and at the sides. There is a band of pollen, usually mainly above the brood, but not always. Bees do vary quite a bit. So for the first 7 to 10 days, they're absolutely crucial for a swarm that's gone into a home without any feeding, without any help or anything like that. It really is the difference between starvation and prosperity, which I think may well be why they're much better at weather forecasting than we are. Now, as a colony expands, the queen lays under the existing brood and at the side. They're expanding the brood all the time. Now, this is different than what we're told, that the queen lays and then lays the circles out. That's in a managed nest, in a natural nest, in an expanding situation. It's usually underneath and at the side. Bees will usually only build comb, A, when it's needed, and B, when they've got some income with which to produce the wax with. One of those out, and they don't usually build anymore. So, in a nectar flow, the emerged cells at the top are filled with pollen and nectar. And you can see this if you've got a new sort of hive with foundation in, because bees swarm will behave a bit like this when they start. Right, now the brood moves down as the nest expands. What you end up with is the brood nest expanding and also growing down like that. So you end up with a bigger brood nest. And you get the older brood at the top, the younger brood at the bottom, because that's where the queen's laying all the time. So in a nectar flow, by the way, those dots are pollen in the cells. In a nectar flow, the brood area is driven down, and the food store increases because they're really replacing brood with food. So you get unused pollen sealed underneath honey for future use. Okay, it's probably bee bread, but you know what I mean. Now the thing is, in the winter, they've got all this food with pollen in, all the way through. Right, now if there's no nectar flow, of course the vacated cells at the top, what happens? Usually the queen lays in them, which really means that the brood nest stays roughly where it is. Then in comes more nectar and down they go again. So in the late summer, the brood nest contracts. Queen usually reduces laying or stops at the end of the summer. With the more native bees, in my part of the world, which is West Sussex, usually first couple of weeks in August they will go off. But the weather's often good in the autumn, get into September. So what do we get? In my area, we get a late flow, both nectar and pollen. And you get quite a lot of pollen both spring and autumn. We get rosebay willow herb, fleabane, ivy, those sort of plants, all of which produce quite good quantities. Ivy has really only started yielding heavily in my area in about the last 10 years, something like that, and it started to cause us problems. I see some Irish people here, and they've always seemed to have had it. What they do to get over the problems that we have, I don't know, because of course ivy granulates very quickly and very solidly. Now, there may be considerable income, quite a bit at the back end of the year. Don't forget, there's not that much brood, so they're not using too much, so they can store it. So a queen tends to come back into lay, and typically in my area they'll go off lay for perhaps 4 weeks, 4 or 5 weeks, something like that. Of course, it's aggravated now because of the treatment, so it's not easy to work out what bees are doing naturally. At that point, we then get winter bees reared, which of course are fed by the recent income. So there's no real burden on the colony. So what can we learn from that? Well, ivy honey granulates, as most of us know, and can cause problems during the winter. But in a natural nest with no restriction, no floorboard, no queen excluder, no crown board, that sort of thing, it's a lot easier for them. Don't forget, last in, first out, the bees can use that ivy honey when they're active. The problem, of course, is with granulated honey, if they're inactive, they can't get out to get water to liquefy it. But October, November is usually no problem. And of course, they've got liquid honey available for the rest of the winter. Don't forget, they've still got a bit of stuff from honey from fleabane, rosebay willow herb, plus, of course, all the stuff they've got in during the summer. But what happens? We take the supers off, don't we? So we've taken all their liquid honey off. So what can end up happening is we put the crown board on, in comes the ivy honey, the queens can then be crowded out, so there are less winter bees produced. And even in the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen colonies with little brood areas about the size of a tennis ball that that's all the queens got to lay in. They seem to survive okay. Of course, then they can have a brood box full of absolutely solid food with less liquid. Now, the hive feels heavy to you. You go along and heft it, cool, that feels like, well, that's all right, that'll last till April. And of course, they starve out because they can't use the food. And this is what happens. Hope you can see all that. So I think Tom mentioned about water collection. They of course need it to liquefy this, but don't forget, if the bees are clustered, it makes it much more difficult for them. So we're back to autumn, winter with little or no income. Queen tends to lay at the top of the brood area and in the vacated cells, and of course they've got all the food that's above them and perhaps to the back, which they survive on during the winter. So that's really how a colony of bees survives the whole year. And of course they've got pollen available throughout their food because they put it there. It's surplus requirements at the time, they've preserved it. Don't forget, they're going to have to live on it for at least 6 months, probably 8, until the spring, when of course new food is coming in. If you get a bad summer, if you work it out, colony could well need that amount of food to get through about 20 months worth. Think about it. So this is what they do. This is some comb that came out of a building, tipped on its side. So the pollen is distributed through the stores, so they've got it. Right, they put a little bit of honey over the top, and if you notice cells with pollen in, they never fill them. They always leave a gap. And of course what they do is if they don't need it, they put honey over it, seal it, and then it will stay for some time. I'm asking the question, do we leave enough pollen for winter? Don't forget, you folk, you take off your supers. How many frames of pollen do you take out? You know what happens. You run it round in the extractor goes out of balance, you start swearing, you put it back in your shed, and what you're doing is putting a load of a resource in that the bees have spent an awful long time collecting. So perhaps we've got to find some way of managing that. And I'll come up with an idea later. So I'm asking, should we feed slowly in the autumn rather than feeding down heavily? If you feed down heavily, get it all done in a week, the bees haven't got a chance to go out and get pollen to put under the nectar in the combs. But if you feed little and often, they can go out and do that. So I'm suggesting that we feed more gently in the autumn. So back to our colony then, we've got spring again, rapid build up again, down goes the brood nest and the cycles continue. So in a natural colony, we get brood underneath the stores, and the brood nest is going up and down all the time depending on conditions. So let's just transfer that over to a managed hive. So there's a natural colony. The top is fixed, always. Brood moves up and down vertically, but in a managed colony, in a managed hive, we put a fixed bit at the bottom, the floor. And then we put another barrier, either the crown board or a queen excluder, so that the queen is confined there. Right? Now the brood nest can't go up and down, so what do? We put the empty comb on top. Where do the bees expect it? Always underneath. Right? So we're actually turning the hive upside down almost. Then of course we put a crown board or inner cover on the top, and it's that goes up and down, so everything's upside down. I'm asking you folks, is the worry hive such a daft idea after all? Because of course that's what they're doing. Or perhaps the rose method, which is a sort of modified way of doing it with a standard hive. Now here's a natural nest, albeit in a barn. Look at the shape of the comb and where things are. In a natural nest, usually the combs are taller than they are wide, certainly in trees anyway, with food above the brood. You can see what's happened there. But here's a pretty standard frame, single brood chamber, in the autumn. I think this was taken early November one year. That's where the entrance is. Of course, the bees put the brood near the entrance. Food should be above the brood, but there isn't that much room. So what have they done? They've gone sideways. Here's not the same frame, but a similar sort of thing in the spring. There's the brood. Should go down, queen laying underneath, but can't do that. So they've been forced sideways. I don't know. I'm just asking if this stresses bees. I don't know. Perhaps somebody's done some work on it, and perhaps nobody's bothered about it. Look at something else as well. We're always told to put pollen above the brood, aren't we? There it is underneath. But native bees, AMM, do tend to put pollen underneath the brood quite regularly. I'm not saying that's a native bee, but that's, it just goes to show that sometimes the books aren't always right. Here's another photograph that's the best part of 50 years old. Another big log. It's probably about that high, I would think. So you can see the cavity. And you can see how black the combs are. That's been in there some time. Here is a building with a different shape. Now, that is where the bees have clearly been for some time. That's where the brood area is. They can't go up, they can't go down. So they've gone sideways. Have they gone sideways to expand? Or have they perhaps gone sideways to move the brood nest, to abandon some comb for the wax moth to clean out, so at some later date they can move back? I don't know, just asking the question. What happens to waste in a colony? Plenty of it. Where does it come from? Cappings, brood cappings, that sort of thing. What happens to it? It drops down to the bottom. How are the bees going to get it out? Well, clicks in there. The answer is wax moth, of course, because they go in, feed on it, and just recycle it and just get rid of it. There's a building with an old colony in, which has died out. In have gone the wax moth, and you can see the mess that it's made of it. Unless there's some mechanism for getting that out, that's actually quite difficult for bees to go in there and establish a nest again. Not only are there cocoons, there are also cobwebs, which of course, as you know, from the inside of a hive roof, cobwebs and bees don't go too well together. I don't think I've ever seen a wild colony with a wax moth problem in the nest area. And I think the reason for this is they've got enough downstairs that they haven't got to bother the rest of the nest in the same way that they do in a managed hive, where we keep everything nice and clean. I'm not suggesting that we should chuck some old wax or comb in the bottom of the hive. I'm not suggesting that, I'm just pointing it out. So are wax moth actually that bad? I think they do a pretty good job, really, one way or another. What I do know is if you keep your colony strong, as they are in the wild, they are no problem. A few random observations. There's only enough comb built by a colony for its immediate needs. If you get a swarm go into a cavity, there's very little drone comb built in the first season. Very little. If you think about it, they don't need it. Also, have a look at natural comb. We tend to think the points of the cells should always be at the top. Actually, it's surprising how often they're not. They can be even at 90 degrees, so you've got a flat at the top and any point in between. If you get emergency cells in a colony and you don't start pulling them out, for the next 2 or 3 years perhaps, you see evidence of where the emergency cell was. I have never ever seen that in a wild colony. So I tend to think that emergency cells are used by the bees because the beekeeper's probably done something wrong. And I can never recall seeing a drone-laying queen in a natural colony. Never. So perhaps that might be induced by the beekeeper as well. But I don't know. I've only probably removed 300 colonies from wild places. Now, drone comb, this is only an estimate. I've never done any measurements, but I reckon area-wise it's about 10 to 15% of the total area on the periphery of the nest, either the side or underneath. If you think about it, the colony only needs it when it's large and built up. So that's and it doesn't need it in the winter when, of course, the nest is contracting. So perhaps that's the reason. I'm asking you, is removing drone comb a good idea? And I know we're told, oh, that's there's a lot of drone comb, drone in that comb. Get rid of it. Bees are telling me that they need 10 to 15%, which in a 10 comb, 11 comb box is roughly 1 comb per box. So that's really the amount we're looking at. How many of you folk do comb changes? How many of you use All Worker Foundation? How many use Drone Foundation in some of your combs? Few, not many. But that's what we tend to do, isn't it? The bees have got to get their drone comb somehow. How are they going to do it? They're going to chew down what's already there. They've decided that's what they want. Plastic foundation. Now, I may be barking up the wrong tree, but earlier this year, and in fact last year, I went out to the States. I was invited out there to do a queen rearing course. And the first apiary I went to, I opened the first colony, and they just seemed, full colony, they seemed absolutely lifeless. You know, there's no sort of vibrancy to them. And it was a beautiful day. It was in June, so it would, and it was quite hot. I'd expected the bees to be pouring in and out. And these bees were absolutely lifeless. And I thought, cocky, bit of a problem here. Went to the next one, and then all of a sudden I thought to myself, where's all the drones? And I spoke to the beekeeper and said, look, no, it don't seem to be too many drones in here compared to our hives. Oh, that's normal, he said. And then it struck me, and I haven't spoken to Tom about this, it struck me that we're just using 100% plastic foundation with no drone in there. And the bees didn't seem to be breaking down the cells, the worker cells, to build a drone. And I think it was just the morale of the colony that was going. So that's a conclusion I came to, which may well be wrong. So what I tend to do in my brood chambers is put 1 drone comb per box, close to the edge, not the outside frame, but the next one in, because that's where the bees are telling me they want it, on the periphery. So let's just look at drone cells. If you look at drone comb, you'll find that bees very, very rarely put pollen in drone cells. If you think about it, they don't really need it during the winter, so perhaps that's why. I'm just asking the question, are they not better for supers? Because what's the point of bees producing or bringing in all that pollen, squeezing through the queen excluder, putting it in those cells for you folk to chuck in the back of your shed to go mouldy? So perhaps we ought to be looking at drone comb in supers rather than worker, which is what I do. Comb spacing. There seems to be 2 main sizes, 38 millimetres, which is the old 1.5 inches, or 36 millimetres. I've religiously measured centre to centre combs in a situation like that, where they're fairly well organised, and it seems to be between 36 and 38 millimetres. Right, that lines up with what I call British spacing, and you measure plastic or metal ends or castellations, they are 38. Hoffmans are 35. Both our Hoffmans and also Langstroth Hoffmans, although interestingly, Dadant Hoffmans are 38. If you think about it, out of that 35 to 38 millimetres, you've got the width of a comb, so the variation is going to be between the gap between the faces of the two combs. And if you think about it, you're dropping down about 30% space. Now, I'm asking if that stresses the bees, because in nature they're telling me that they want 36 to 38 millimetres. Does it increase swarming? All these bees packed together closer than they should be. Does it increase chronic bee paralysis virus? We had a question and answer session on Thursday, and somebody asked a question about chronic bee paralysis virus, and the answer came back, or one of the answers came back, was that the bees that are packed together, they break the hairs off each other, and it transmits the virus. So I'm just asking the question, does it make the situation with the virus worse? I don't know, no evidence. That's for somebody else to sort out. This is a wood factory, well, not anymore because it was taken down. But what it was a sawdust hopper. And there's a colony inside there. You can see that they've already made an attempt to propellise up the hole. Just look and see what's inside, if indeed you can. And firstly, you wouldn't get food anywhere near an entrance like that. The bees will put it away somewhere, presumably for defence reasons. You can see brood on the right there, but yes, they'll put that there, but they wouldn't put food. You can also see the points of the cells are not at the top. So that's another instance of the bees not always putting cells at the top. This is another building, wooden building. The bees have propellised the entrance up, look. I think that was a woodpecker tried to get in there. This was their only ventilation. Only ventilation. See what the bees have done? They put two little holes in there, about the size you get the finger in. So the overall size of that was 70 millimetres by 45, so less than 3 by less than 2. Right? And the bees had decided that that was too difficult to defend. So I'm asking if our entrances are too big. Always think about, got to have big wide entrances so the bees can fly in and out. They're doing okay. Propolis curtains. Most of you have probably heard more about them than seen them. In fact, they're not particularly common. Probably 1 in 10 or even less. This one here was taken out of an elm tree, so that'll tell you how long ago that was taken. That one was about 10 inches, 250 millimetres long. And you can see just under here part of the rotten wood. So it was in the entrance by the rotten wood, and there was a slot in the tree about 8 or 10 inches high, only about ½ an inch wide. These curtains can be around about 6 to 8 millimetres. That's about the thickest you get. That is absolutely solid propolis. Solid propolis. Oh, propolis. This is a board out of a wooden building. And I hope you can see there that the bees have actually smeared propolis all over the wood. Why have they done that? Because it was presumably a sawn board, it wouldn't have been a plain board, but a sawn board, there was no need to. But we tend to think that the bees propellise the inside of their nest, and they do propellise all the inside of their nest in time. They don't do it instantly. We tend to think it's a stabilised rotten wood, which of course it may well do. But we now know that because propolis is antibacterial, antifungal and anti-everything else you can think of, that they're probably smearing the inside of their home for health reasons. We do get some bees that propellise a lot heavier than others. Should we actually requeen them, or are they perhaps healthier bees? It might be a little study that somebody could do, they might even have done it, I don't know. how many of you folk scorch your boxes out to keep things nice and clean and that sort of thing? How many of you? Okay. Right. I'm wondering if we're actually not doing the bees a bit of harm, because don't forget they're smearing the inside of their nest for their own health reasons. I'm just asking the question, do we actually clean our kit too much? I have never ever scorched out a brood box. Are we not doing the bees any harm? I'll ask the question again. Now, how many of you are scorching your boxes out? Less than it was 10 seconds ago. This is a cavity. This building had to get taken down because it was going to an open-air museum. This cavity has clearly been reoccupied. You can see evidence of previous occupation there, and you can see wax moth cocoons here. But look at it. It's nowhere near the shape of a natural nest. Nowhere near the shape. It's wider than it is high. Now, combs can be built in any direction. Forget all this north and south stuff, east and west or whatever that some people put up. In a natural nest, they will go any way. Okay, something fairly open like that, where they've got a clear space, yes, they will probably build them all in line. But even these, that one there, they built at a different angle. Why do they build them at different angles? Oh, firstly, they don't always follow previous combs. So where you've seen a line of comb that's perhaps been taken down, it could be somebody that's removed a colony 5, 10 years ago or whatever. They don't always follow the previous comb. So perhaps there's nothing in the sort of north and south business. What I do know is that in the vast majority of cases, they are in line with what I call energy lines. They may not be energy lines, but if anybody wants to talk to me about it afterwards, I'm happy to. I've had it said to me on so many occasions, oh yeah, but you're influencing this way and the other. When that particular one was covered up, I could predict which way the combs were likely to go. And I can still do that now, even though it's open. So I think there's something in it. With a natural nest, you get the bees at the bottom, food at the top. During the winter, and in a natural nest, you can probably have as few as 4 or 5 combs, sort of 6 or so, and that's probably 6 to 8, perhaps is an average. All they do during the winter is munch, 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 all the way up. No problem at all. But of course, in a situation like this, they munch, munch, munch up, all of a sudden hit the wood. What do? Because if they're in tight cluster, they're not likely to move. Right, so what the bees do, I think they forage within the nest in the winter when it's a cooler warmer period. They break cluster, go out and bring food in to where they are. And I've seen evidence of that, or what I think is evidence, on many occasions. You could go in a colony in, let's say, December, and there's quite a lot of unsealed food around where the bees are clustering. Colony density, natural colony density, that is. Here's a barn in West Sussex, about 5 miles from me. In the end of that barn, there are 3 nests, and you can see 2 of them have been in there a fair length of time. There was actually another one there. So in a barn, from here to that wall, on the end wall, at least 4 nests at any one time. Now, in 2009, that particular barn, I was involved in removing 11 colonies or swarms from that barn. So there was something going on. Why pick on that? There was plenty of trees, there were buildings around. Now, we would think, as humans, that the higher the density, the more pressure there is put on the forage outside, wouldn't we? So why not move half a mile away, or take up home half a mile away? Actually, there's a whole load of energy lines going through the end of that barn, but I won't hold you up on that one. Holes in nests. This is one area where Tom and myself did have a little bit of a discussion, and he's made me think a bit more about what I've seen. In a tree with a fairly narrow cavity, I now agree with Tom. You get less holes in the comb. In a wide area like that, and we're probably talking about 18 inches wide, 15, 18 inches wide, something like that, you generally get holes and, of course, bee spaces down the side. So what are they using it for? We suspect travel and communication, for one thing, cut time down and that sort of thing, or perhaps distributing pheromones. Now, if you have got a great big slab of comb and the queen's laying on one side, I don't know how queens move around in a hive, but let's say she moves, she stays on one side for half an hour, 3/4 an hour, something like that. How do her pheromones get round to the rest of the bees? If you've just got a big slab of comb, they've got to get over the top, underneath, round the side to get to the other bees. Have they got holes so that they can communicate better between themselves and other bees? Does it contribute to swarming if you've got this great big slab of brood? Asking the question, are our frames too large? 14 by 12s, Dadants, Langstroths and that sort of thing. Is it actually causing the bees a problem? On the other hand, should we actually cull combs with holes in? I suggest we don't. What I do know is I've never seen isolation starvation in a wild colony. So perhaps during the winter, the bees can move through between one comb and another, whereas in a managed colony, they can't get round the ends of the combs. So why not make holes in your comb? Perhaps an apple core or something like that, just one hole in the middle of each one and see if it works. The bees I've dealt with, they're usually very good tempered. I cannot remember a bad tempered wild colony. Don't know why that is, but I can't. Now, if they're established for some time, they have got the characteristics of our native bees. They are usually non-prolific, or always non-prolific. When I say established for some time, at least 12 months. They're usually dark. You do not get these bright yellow jobbies with their bright yellow queens. You do not get them living in natural situations. Just don't even see it. They don't live very long. I think probably they need a lot more food than other colonies, and perhaps they're not quite tough. But if you think about it, it's natural selection, which is exactly the things that two gentlemen 170 years ago with the names of Wallace and Darwin were telling us, and we're still not listening, are we? Because we've got beekeepers who still keep buying imports. It was native bees that evolved here. Okay, there aren't so many as there were, but at least let the bees, or have bees that have got their same characteristics. Combs. I have seen some very old, very black and very heavy ones. They have been there a long time. And you know what we're told about these combs? They're disease, this, that and the other. Bees always seem very healthy, because if they're not, nature takes them out. I do wonder if perhaps the heavier the comb, the better the insulation. Don't know, might be a red herring. I have never seen foul brood in a wild colony. Never, never, never. And any chalk brood is usually very light. If there is any, you don't get masses of chalk brood like you do in a managed colony. So I'm asking the question, are wild colonies always a reservoir for disease that we're told they are? I suspect they're probably not. On the other hand, are disease levels in managed colonies falsely high? I suspect they are. People doing things, moving combs around, all sorts of things like that without recognising the diseases. Do the comb changes and the medicines and the cleansers and the supplements, all sorts of things that we're supposed to do, does it actually suppress the natural disease resistance of the bees? I don't know, I'm just asking a question. Are we hindering natural selection? So, just a few thoughts. Do bees survive because they're adaptable, despite what we chuck at them? Do we really understand our bees? Really understand? Do we, at the end of the day, treat them kindly? All the things we're supposed to do to them, are we actually treating them kindly? Do we encourage stock that nature wouldn't tolerate? Is best practice always best? And should we change our thinking? I don't know, but I'm asking you if you've changed yours. I've just got more information on Cushman's website. Now your turn, Tom.